Lieutenant Commander Jack Samuel was the epitome of discipline and dedication. Standing tall on the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, he was every inch the decorated Navy officer, a man who had given 20 years of his life to serve his country. At 42, Jack had everything a man could want: a loving wife, 2 sons who adored him, and a home that symbolized stability and comfort in Hyde Park, Chicago. His wife, Stella, was as perfect a partner as Jack could imagine. She was vivacious, intelligent, and beautiful, a self-made interior designer whose creativity brought life to every room she touched. Together, they were a picture of success, hosting barbecues on weekends and attending charity galas that showcased Stella's eye for aesthetics. Their 2 sons, Marcus and Devin, were the joys of his life. Marcus, 10, shared Jack's calm demeanor, while 8-year-old Devin was a bundle of energy who could light up any room. Jack worked tirelessly to ensure his family never wanted for anything, and when he wasn't at sea, he immersed himself in family life, helping with school projects, attending games, and carving out precious moments with Stella. Yet, cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. Jack couldn't quite place what was off. Stella had become slightly more distant, her phone often buzzing with messages she dismissed too quickly. But Jack, trusting to a fault, attributed it to her busy work life. The one person who seemed always dependable was John Benson, Jack's best friend since high school. John, a successful realtor, was like a brother to Jack and had stepped in during his long deployments. Whether it was fixing a broken fence or taking the boys out for ice cream, John had become an extension of the Samuel family. But while Jack saw John as an ally, he couldn't see what was happening right under his nose. Stella Samuel was a woman torn between duty and desire. Her life with Jack had been built on a solid foundation of love and respect, but after years of his absence during deployments, loneliness began to creep in. Jack was a good man, but the long stretches apart left Stella feeling like a ghost in her own marriage. When John Benson entered her life in a more intimate way, it was as if a light had been switched on. He had always been around as Jack's best friend, but Stella hadn't noticed how his easy humor and warm presence filled the void left by her husband's absence. What started as late-night talks and shared laughs turned into something far more dangerous. One fateful evening, Stella found herself unable to resist the pull of John's comfort. She convinced herself it was a moment of weakness, but that night quickly turned into many. Over the years, their affair became a complicated routine, secret rendezvous, shared glances at family gatherings, and covert text messages. Despite her attempts to compartmentalize her life, Stella struggled with guilt. She often looked at Marcus and Devin, the sons she shared with Jack, and felt the weight of her betrayal. What made it worse was the undeniable resemblance between Marcus and John, a resemblance she prayed Jack would never notice. John, too, was trapped in the web of deception. He was deeply in love with Stella, but his growing attachment to the boys complicated his emotions. He wasn't just Stella's lover, he was also their father. The burden of the secret was a constant shadow over their illicit relationship, and both John and Stella knew it was only a matter of time before their perfect facade would crack. Jack Samuel had always prided himself on being a man of integrity and intuition. As a decorated Navy officer, his life revolved around discipline and order, and he expected the same from his personal relationships. However, his return from his most recent deployment brought an unfamiliar tension to his family life. It wasn't just the occasional awkward silences or Stella's uncharacteristic evasiveness. It was something deeper, an instinct telling him that all was not as it seemed. The first crack in the facade came one sunny Saturday afternoon. Jack was in the backyard, tossing a baseball with Marcus. The boys had inherited their parents' athleticism, but Marcus in particular had a natural skill that always impressed Jack. As Marcus effortlessly threw a perfect curveball, Jack asked where he'd learned the technique. "Uncle John showed me," Marcus replied nonchalantly. Jack froze. He knew John Benson, his best friend since boot camp, wasn't a baseball enthusiast, let alone someone who could teach such a technical pitch. While Marcus continued to chatter, Jack's mind raced. Why would John be spending enough time with Marcus to teach him something so specific? A few weeks later, Jack noticed another inconsistency. Stella had become more guarded with her phone, often placing it face down on the kitchen counter or taking calls in another room. When Jack casually mentioned wanting to surprise her at work one evening, her reaction was far from enthusiastic. "Oh, you don't have to do that," she said quickly, her smile strained. The unease in her voice lingered in his mind long after the conversation ended. Determined to get answers, Jack began quietly observing Stella's behavior. One evening, when she left her phone unattended, he accessed her messages. While he didn't find explicit evidence of an affair, the tone of her conversations with John was unusually personal. He also noticed a series of deleted messages, which only deepened his suspicions. The final blow came when Jack stumbled upon an old family photo album. As he flipped through pictures of birthday parties and holiday gatherings, he noticed a pattern. John was present in almost every significant moment. In many photos, his interactions with Stella seemed unusually close. But it wasn't just their dynamic that caught Jack's attention, it was Marcus's resemblance to John. The shape of his jawline, the curve of his nose, even the color of his eyes. Unable to shake the gnawing doubt, Jack ordered DNA tests for both Marcus and Devin, collecting their samples under the guise of a science project. When the results arrived, they confirmed his worst fear. Neither boy was biologically his. Armed with the truth, Jack's mind shifted from confusion to anger. He began meticulously piecing together the timeline of Stella and John's betrayal. He scoured bank statements, tracking unexplained charges that coincided with John's visits. Phone records showed late-night calls and frequent texts exchanged between Stella and John. Jack confronted Stella one evening, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. "Are the boys mine?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Stella's face paled. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. Jack handed her the DNA test results. "Don't lie to me, Stella. I already know." Tears streamed down her face as she confessed to the affair. She tried to explain it away as a mistake, blaming Jack's long absences for her loneliness. But Jack wasn't interested in excuses. The betrayal wasn't just about Stella's infidelity. It was about the family he had devoted his life to, a family built on lies. Jack's confrontation with John was far more volatile. He cornered John at a local bar, slamming a photo of Marcus and the DNA results onto the table. "You betrayed me," Jack growled, his fists clenched. "You didn't just take my wife, you took my family." John tried to defuse the situation, claiming it had been a mistake, but Jack's icy glare made it clear there was no forgiveness to be had. Jack left the bar that night with a singular focus: retribution. Jack Samuel's plan for revenge began to take shape the moment he uncovered the truth about Stella and John. The betrayal wasn't something he could simply move past. It had consumed him, turning every waking moment into a bitter reminder of the life he'd been robbed of. But Jack was a man of precision, trained to handle high-stakes situations. This wasn't going to be a spur-of-the-moment act. It would be methodical, calculated, and definitive. The idea of a reunion came to him as the perfect ruse. Jack reached out to Stella and John, framing the invitation as an opportunity to bury the past and move forward for the sake of the boys. He suggested a weekend at the family's secluded lake house in Michigan, a place that once held fond memories of happier times. Stella, eager to smooth things over and alleviate her guilt, agreed without hesitation. John, more reluctant, eventually gave in, seeing it as a way to placate both Stella and Jack. The lake house was an isolated retreat surrounded by dense woods and the calm expanse of the lake. As they arrived, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Jack played the role of the gracious host flawlessly, masking his simmering rage with a facade of forgiveness. The boys, oblivious to the undercurrents, delighted in the chance to fish, play, and explore the woods. On the second evening, Jack suggested a celebratory dinner. He grilled steaks, poured wine, and made sure the boys were settled in bed before calling Stella and John to the deck overlooking the lake. As they ate and reminisced, Jack subtly guided the conversation toward their shared past. His words were laced with veiled accusations, his tone shifting from amicable to cutting. "You know," Jack said, swirling his glass of whiskey, Trust is the foundation of any relationship. It's funny how fragile it can be, don't you think? Stella glanced nervously at John, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Jack, we're here to move forward," she said, her voice trembling. Jack's eyes bore into hers. "Move forward? After everything you've done? Do you really think that's possible?" Before they could respond, Jack reached under the table, revealing a firearm. "No more lies," he said coldly. "It's time for the truth." He forced them inside, tying them to chairs in the basement. Stella sobbed uncontrollably, begging for mercy, while John struggled against the restraints. Jack's composure was unnerving as he detailed the pain they had caused him, his voice devoid of emotion. "You didn't just betray me," he said. "You destroyed everything I believed in." Despite their pleas, Jack was unrelenting. Using his military training, he ensured their deaths were swift, but left no traceable evidence. Under the cover of darkness, he buried their bodies deep in the woods, far from where anyone would think to look. By morning, the lake house was spotless, and Jack returned to Chicago with the boys, his plan executed flawlessly. The days after the disappearance of Stella and John were filled with confusion and suspicion. On the surface, everything appeared to be in order. Jack's life went on as usual, and he even made appearances in public, acting as if nothing had happened. But something about their disappearance didn't sit right with Detective Marcus Washington, a seasoned investigator with the Chicago Police Department, known for his unerring ability to read people and find connections that others might miss. Detective Washington was called in after the case was flagged as suspicious. While the official narrative, Stella and John running away together, was plausible, Washington wasn't convinced. For one, it didn't make sense that they would abandon their family responsibilities, especially their children, without any prior warning or a single communication after their disappearance. They had left behind clothes, personal items, and even their phones, something that was highly unusual for people supposedly fleeing to start a new life. He began digging into their lives, looking for any gaps in the story, and that's when he stumbled across a critical piece of evidence: phone records. It seemed that just before their disappearance, Stella and John had been in frequent contact with Jack. The calls and texts started increasing in frequency as the date of their planned weekend getaway to the lake house approached. The final calls, however, were the most telling. They were cut off abruptly, just hours before they were last seen. Something about it didn't add up, and the investigator's suspicion grew. He expanded the investigation, re-interviewing friends, family, and neighbors. The testimony of a few key witnesses stood out. A neighbor who had seen Jack loading items into his truck in the days leading up to the weekend getaway noticed something odd. He wasn't just packing clothes or supplies for a family trip. He was loading what looked like large tarps, heavy-duty shovels, and tools, items that seemed out of place for a simple visit to the lake house. Then came the breakthrough: surveillance footage from a nearby gas station where Stella and John had stopped for fuel on their way to the lake house. The footage showed them entering the station, but strangely, no footage showed them leaving. The footage from the following days showed no sign of them anywhere, not even in nearby towns. Detective Washington ordered a search of the lake house property. It was a secluded area, surrounded by dense woods and with a large, peaceful lake at its edge. But as the team combed the area, they found something that sent chills down their spines: traces of blood in the basement, despite any sign of struggle. A closer examination with luminol revealed small stains that had been carefully scrubbed away, a clear indication of an attempt to clean up the crime scene. This was no accidental death or sudden outburst, it was calculated. The investigation took a darker turn when forensic experts uncovered disturbed soil near the woods behind the lake house. After conducting soil analysis and excavating the area, they unearthed something even more chilling: 2 bodies, carefully buried but not deep enough to conceal the truth. It was Stella and John. Forensic examination of the bodies revealed that both had died from gunshot wounds. The bodies had been moved, likely just hours after death, and buried in a shallow grave to avoid detection. There were no signs of a struggle, which made it even clearer that they had been caught off guard, perhaps by someone they trusted. Everything pointed back to one man, Jack. The timing of the deaths, the method of execution, and the steps taken to cover up the crime all matched his precise military background. Jack Samuel had carefully planned and executed the murder of his wife and her lover. But despite the mounting evidence, Jack remained outwardly calm. He denied any involvement and insisted that the couple had simply vanished. However, as the investigation progressed, cracks began to show in his story. Phone records, security footage, and witness statements all painted a damning picture. The trial of Jack Samuel became one of the most talked about cases in Chicago's history. The media was obsessed with the story of the Navy officer turned murderer, how he had meticulously planned the deaths of his wife, Stella, and her lover, John, and then worked relentlessly to cover up his crimes, all while maintaining the facade of a grieving husband and father. The sensational details of his carefully constructed lies, the blood on his hands, and his cold-blooded manipulation of his own children, who remained unaware of the truth for months, gripped the public. But beyond the sensationalism of the case, a deeper truth emerged, a story of betrayal, revenge, and the innocent lives caught in between. The court proceedings were drawn out and emotional. The evidence against Jack was overwhelming, from the forensic analysis that tied him to the crime scene to the testimonies of witnesses who described his erratic behavior leading up to the murders. Still, Jack sat in the courtroom, maintaining an air of stoic indifference, as if the world outside him no longer mattered. His once pristine reputation as a Navy officer had shattered. The prosecutor, knowing that this case was more than just about justice, framed their arguments not only as a search for accountability, but as a message to the community about the dangers of unchecked vengeance and obsession. The defense attempted to argue that Jack had acted out of temporary insanity, that the years of betrayal from his wife and his best friend had driven him to a breaking point. They painted him as a man emotionally destroyed, whose entire world had been turned upside down. But the jury was unmoved. The coldness with which Jack had executed the crime, the careful planning involved, and the way he continued the charade of being a grieving father for months all pointed to a man who had not been broken by grief, but had been driven by something far darker: revenge. After days of deliberation, the jury found Jack Samuel guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with a mix of relief and shock. No one could believe that such a carefully constructed life, one of military precision, family pride, and public respect, had collapsed under the weight of such darkness. In the weeks following the trial, Jack was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was taken to Stateville Correctional Center, a maximum security prison where he would spend the rest of his days. He was no longer the powerful Navy officer or the father who had once commanded respect. Now, he was just another prisoner, one who had lost everything. His letters, once filled with pride and authority, became sporadic, always sent to his sons, Marcus and Devin, but never answered. The boys had made it clear there was nothing Jack could say that would change the truth of what he had done. Years passed, and while Jack Samuel's life in prison continued in the shadows, the lives of his children moved forward, shaped by a legacy of tragedy and a determination to rise above it. Their story, one of unimaginable pain and loss, became a part of Chicago's history, a cautionary tale told over and over again. It was discussed in courtrooms, psychology classrooms, and even among those who simply lived in the South Side neighborhood, a place where stories of betrayal, justice, and revenge seemed all too familiar. But what struck the people who lived through it all the most was how Marcus and Devin had survived. 9 years after Jack's conviction, Marcus Samuel Benson, now 19 years old, walked into Stateville Correctional Center. His posture had changed, no longer the broken teenager who had been forced to face the brutal truth of his father's actions, but a young man with purpose. He was here not out of anger or the desire for closure, but out of a need to understand. His father had been a man who, by all accounts, loved him, but his love was warped by obsession, anger, and revenge. Marcus needed answers to questions that had lingered in his mind for years. He sat across from Jack, who had visibly aged during his time in prison. His hair had turned gray, his military posture had crumbled, and his once imposing presence now seemed diminished. But the look in his eyes was still familiar. The same man who had controlled his family with an iron fist, who had once been the father figure Marcus had revered. "You've grown," Jack said quietly, his voice hoarse with years of confinement. Marcus didn't flinch. "That happens in 9 years," he replied, his voice steady, but tinged with the weight of everything he had lived through. "Devin didn't come," Marcus continued. "He's at baseball practice. State championships next week." He paused. "He's team captain now, like our father was." The deliberate emphasis on the word was stung, but Jack's eyes flinched at the weight of the truth in Marcus's words. "Why did you agree to see me?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid of the answer himself. "Because I need to understand something," Marcus replied, leaning forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Not why you killed them, I get that. Rage, betrayal, all of it. But why maintain the lie afterward? Why pretend to be our grieving father for months?" Jack's hands trembled slightly as he stared down at the table, the silence stretching between them. "Because those months were all I had left," Jack confessed, his voice cracking with a rawness Marcus hadn't anticipated. "Once the truth came out, I knew I'd lose you both forever. I needed to be your father one last time." Marcus's eyes hardened. He stood up slowly, the anger rising in his chest once again. "You were never our father. A father protects his children from pain. You've buried ours in the ground." With those final words, Marcus turned and walked out of the prison room, leaving Jack with nothing but the painful consequences of his actions. Later that evening, Marcus drove back to the South Side house where he and Devin now lived with their grandmother. The old Victorian had been carefully restored, with Stella's touches preserved like a museum to her artistic vision. Their lives, although marked by loss, were slowly being rebuilt, one step at a time. Devin, at 17, was practicing his pitching in the backyard. He had become the spitting image of John, down to the way he adjusted his baseball cap. He was the one with a future ahead of him, a future that was full of promise. He had the athletic scholarships to prove it. Inside, their grandmother was preparing dinner, and photos of Stella and John lined the walls. The boys had stopped hiding the truth years ago. There was no need to anymore. They had found a way to accept their past, to honor the good moments they had with their parents, while acknowledging the darkness that had followed. On Marcus's desk lay his college acceptance letters, Northwestern, University of Chicago, Stanford, each offering a future where he could leave behind the pain and move towards something greater. Devin was already fielding offers from major baseball teams, his pitching arm as strong as John's had been. It seemed as though he was following in his father's footsteps, but this time, there was no dark legacy attached. In his dreams, Marcus still saw the lake house, but instead of darkness and secrets, he saw his parents as they really were, young, in love, flawed but human. He saw them laughing together by the water, with him and Devin playing nearby. There were no graves beneath the oak tree, no betrayal, and no revenge. It was a peaceful vision of what might have been if not for the tragedy that had shaped their lives. When he awoke, he found tears on his pillow, tears for the lost years, for the innocence stolen from him and his brother. As time passed, the story of the Samuel family became part of Chicago's criminal history, a study in how betrayal, obsession, and revenge can destroy lives. But it was also a story of resilience, how two boys survived unimaginable trauma and built meaningful lives out of the wreckage. Marcus and Devin had established a foundation that supported children affected by domestic violence and parental loss, something that had been close to their heart. The lake house property, once the scene of such horrific crimes, was demolished, and in its place stood a memorial garden where purple irises, Stella's favorite flower, bloomed each spring. Marcus, now studying psychology at Northwestern, helped counsel youth trauma survivors, and Devin wore his father John's number on his baseball jersey as a tribute to the man he never really knew, but whose memory he had embraced in a way his father, Jack, never could. The Samuel Benson Foundation's motto, chosen by Marcus and Devin, read, "Truth buried deep grows toward the light." And in their mother's restored garden, new flowers bloomed each year, just as they had learned that life, no matter how soaked in tragedy, persists. beauty finds a way to grow. Viewers, what drives a person to go to such extreme lengths to betray the very people they claim to love? Is it the overwhelming weight of their own pain, or perhaps the temptation to take control of a situation that feels entirely out of their hands? How does someone justify taking another's life, even when consumed by feelings of rage, jealousy, or betrayal? Is it possible that, in the heat of the moment, the line between right and wrong becomes so blurred that a person loses themselves entirely? Or is there something deeper, a darkness lurking beneath the surface, that drives them to commit an irreversible act? What makes someone choose revenge over healing, and why do they continue to perpetuate a light even when the truth is far more destructive? How can a person live with themselves after deceiving the very people who trust them, even when they know the cost will be immense? Is it guilt, fear, or a need to protect themselves from the fallout that keeps them locked in a web of falsehoods? How do we reconcile the love we feel for someone with the undeniable darkness they may harbor deep inside? Is it possible to forgive the unforgivable, or are some betrayals too deep to heal? When faced with the collapse of everything they once knew, how do two boys, torn apart by tragedy, rebuild their lives from the ashes? Can they ever truly break free from the weight of their past, or are they destined to carry that legacy forever? What does it take to survive when your world has been shattered, your family torn apart, and your innocence stolen? Is resilience enough to overcome such deep scars, or do the remnants of the past always linger, no matter how much time passes? And when the dust finally settles, when the truth is uncovered and all the pieces fall into place, do we ever truly understand why it all happened? Or do we simply learn to accept it, to live with the wreckage, knowing that some things are beyond our control? Perhaps we never fully comprehend the depths of the choices others make, but in time, we come to realize that the healing process isn't just about finding answers. It's about learning to live with the pain, finding meaning in the darkness, and hoping that one day, the light will return.